Welcome to the November 5th, 2021 Amherst History Society History Bites lecture. My name is George Naughton, president of the Amherst Historical Society. Today's guest is Dr. Julie Dobrow of Tufts University. Her book, After Emily, was published in 2018 and was the product of years of research into Mabel Loomis Todd and her family and their relations with each other and with the Dickinson family. Mabel was the one who brought Emily's poems to the world. She was tasked with editing and publishing, I think it was the first 3 volumes of Emily's poetry. But today's lecture is going to be more concerned, I think, with the family dynamics and relations. The Todd families, David, who was a world-traveling astronomer, Millicent, their daughter. And so, without further ado, I think Dr. Dobrow.
Thank you, George. Well, I'm excited to be back with you all at the Amherst Historical Society, at least virtually. And I'm delighted to have another opportunity to speak about the Todds. I will say that one really good thing about having talks on Zoom is that it's enabled friends and colleagues who are outside of Amherst to join us. I see one person at least who's joining us from California, so welcome. And I will mention that the talk that I'm going to give is an illustrated version of an essay that I wrote for the Amherst College bicentennial book, which is called Amherst in the World, which contains not only my essay, but a number of really interesting essays about different aspects of Amherst College and how the college is really, from its start, was really in a lot of ways connected to the outside world. I'm also looking forward to coming back to the Amherst Historical Society in the spring, hopefully in person, to talk about my new book project on Elaine and Charles Eastman. He was one of the outstanding astronomers of his time, noted David Peck Todd's obituary in the New York Times. A professor of astronomy and navigation and director of the Observatory at Amherst College for nearly 40 years. In the Amherst Record, an obituary of his wife, Mabel Loomis Todd, came under the headline, "A Friend of Amherst," and mentioned among other attributes, "For the interests of Amherst College, too, Mrs. Todd was always on the alert." An Amherst alumnus added, "She was so wrought into the fiber of all the old Amherst life in my college days and for many years after, that her death brought with it a real pang." And the obituary of their only child, Millicent Todd Bingham, firmly situated her as the child of her father, a professor of astronomy at Amherst College, and her mother, someone who, quote, "labored for many years deciphering the letters and poetry illegibly written much earlier by her former Amherst neighbor, Emily Dickinson." This tribute also noted that one of Millicent's major life accomplishments was her gift to Amherst College of all the manuscripts and a daguerreotype, the one known likeness of Emily Dickinson as an adult. In death, as in life, the Todds' affiliations with the town of Amherst and with Amherst College closely aligned with their achievements. As the headlines of their respective obituaries suggested, each of them had made significant contributions to their individual fields, but one of the most salient features of their lives was their home in Amherst and the relationships with the college. Indeed, it might be argued that their relationships with Amherst were part of the glue that bound this small family together, despite the many and varied trying circumstances that they encountered, both individually and collectively. David Peck Todd's years at Amherst College were marked by notable achievements and significant failures, remarkable publicity for his work and stunning notoriety for it, and personal tumult that roiled his family, the town, and the college, and ultimately resulted in his forced, quote unquote, retirement. His contributions to the college included the development of its nascent astronomy program and the eventual construction of Wilder Observatory. as well as a host of stories about his many peculiarities, such as his penchant for collecting toilet seats from around the world, which might or might not have been apocryphal, but to this day are often repeated. More broadly, he made major inroads in astrophotography and became known internationally for his eclipse expeditions. But the professional efforts of his later years and the personal turbulence of his life might have overshadowed his achievements, and these too reverberated out from Amherst to the world. David first came to Amherst College in 1872. He had transferred from Columbia University, where he'd started as a precocious 15-year-old. David chose to come to Amherst because the college had both a program in astronomy and an observatory. In 1874, during the fall of his senior year, David developed calculations about the transit of Venus, a rare astronomical event that occurs just twice a century, in which the full outline of Venus can be seen as it passes between the sun and the Earth. Though he was just an undergraduate student at the time, his calculations became widely known and cited by many astronomers of the day. By 1878, David had obtained both an AB and an MA degree from Amherst, and his research on the satellites of Jupiter during the time of their eclipses caught the eye of Simon Newcomb, director of the U.S. Nautical Almanac Office. Newcomb, tasked with developing a standard of astronomical calculations, thought that David's work could be useful in testing his own theories about the change of the rotational period of the Earth. He invited David to join him at the U.S. Naval Observatory, a position that David held until 1881, when he returned to Amherst. David returned to the college as an instructor of astronomy and director of the observatory. He also returned with his young wife, Mabel, whom he married in 1879. The couple left behind in Washington, D.C. with Mabel's parents, their young daughter, Millicent, born in 1880. And I will say parenthetically right here, one of the questions that I'm always asked when I give talks is whether Millicent Todd Bingham was truly the child of Mabel and David. I think this says that she really was. David taught at Amherst until 1917, rising through the academic ranks and serving as secretary of the faculty between 1891 and 1909. One of his lasting contributions to the college was the construction of the Wilder Observatory, which opened in 1903 with what was at the time the world's largest Clark refractor telescope. Even today, it remains one of the largest. At the time that David returned to Amherst, the college was starting to pivot from its origins in educating young men for the ministry to providing a more secular education with a greater emphasis on professional knowledge production. In the early 20th century, Amherst had already earned a spot on lists of institutions responsible for the undergraduate education of, quote, significant American men of science. And yet, David Todd always felt that his work at Amherst was in constant tension between the college of old, which depended more on theology than science, and what he increasingly saw and felt should be the new directions, an opposition that others around him also felt. Now, interestingly, even one of Emily Dickinson's poems evocatively utilizes eclipses as a metaphor for this tension between faith and scientifically garnered knowledge. Sunset at night is natural, but sunset on the dawn reverses nature, master. So midnight's dew at noon, eclipses be predicted, and science bows them in. But do one face us suddenly? Jehovah's watch is wrong. Much of David's astronomy work in the early years of his career at Amherst focused on the measurement of solar activities of different kinds. His early calculations of the 1874 transit of Venus led him to be appointed as the astronomer in charge at the Mount Lick Observatory the next time a transit of Venus was to occur in 1882. David traveled to California and spent 2 months there, tinkering, setting up, and refining photographic equipment. Now, during the 2004 transit of Venus, astronomers at the Lick Observatory rediscovered some of David's stills in storage vaults there, photos that they considered to be superb. They digitally animated them, something that would have thrilled David because he had foreseen that moving pictures would be the best way to document certain kinds of astronomical phenomena. After his work on the transit of Venus, David turned his attention to other types of solar movement. Although total eclipses of the sun occur every year, the vantage point from which they can best be seen on Earth varies widely. This led David to organize eclipse expeditions that spanned the globe. In all, he led a dozen such expeditions, taking him to 5 continents and more than 30 countries. 2 of the expeditions were specifically known as the Amherst expeditions. This was the 1896 trek to Japan and the 1901 voyage to the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, both funded by Amherst alumnus, railroad magnate, and multimillionaire Arthur Curtis James, class of 1889. David also chased eclipses in Angola, Brazil, Peru, Libya, and Russia, among other countries. Each of these expeditions required months of planning, hundreds of calculations, and a great deal of fundraising. David shipped enormous telescopes overseas and hired local teams to transport them to remote mountaintops where they were reassembled. It took David and his team, which sometimes included Mabel and eventually Millicent, weeks of arduous travel to arrive at the eclipse destinations. He often needed to invent or modify equipment to meet the local conditions when he arrived. Some of these journeys provided excellent opportunities for Mabel to capture them in words, sometimes in articles that appeared in some of the most important magazines and newspapers of the day, as well as 2 books that she published about eclipse expeditions, one on the first Japanese expedition and one on the 2 expeditions to Tripoli. Many of David's efforts went towards trying to document the path of an eclipse with photographic equipment that could monitor its movement. He developed plans for a new type of telescope and worked to invent a mechanism that would enable him to take many exposures rapidly to track an eclipse. David first experimented with this during the 1887 expedition to Japan and refined the apparatus on subsequent expeditions. Now, it's perhaps not surprising that David, who was also a fine musician and had once considered a career as a professional organist, came up with the idea to construct an apparatus that would, quote, use air at reduced pressure and was operated by means of a small organ-like foot-powered machine equipped with a perforated paper roll similar to those used on a player piano. Now, later in life, David believed that this invention was perhaps his most important contribution to astronomy. Indeed, today, animation and film are considered fundamental methods of capturing patterns of eclipses. Moreover, in a posthumous tribute, David's former student, Charles Hudson, Amherst class of 1910, wrote, "How much Dr. Todd's accomplishments influenced Edison and others in the years close to 1893, when this topic was the object of much research on moving pictures, may never be known. His work was done with glass plates, since film was hardly known at the time." However, for all the ingenuity, the long and difficult travel, the endless calculations that David put into the eclipse expeditions, almost all of them ended in disappointment when nature intervened and the clouds closed in. After several of these failures, David attempted to inform astronomers along an eclipse's path by telegraph so that a more collaborative and coordinated effort in photographing an eclipse could be made. In recognition of this work, in 1888, Washington and Jefferson College awarded him an honorary doctorate. However, the failed eclipse expeditions had long-lasting consequences for David. So consistently was his planning thwarted, and so widely did it become known that once, years after his death, a famous British astronomer mentioned to Millicent that her father might better be remembered as Professor Todd of the cloudy eclipses. In his appreciation of David, Charles Hudson suggested, perhaps it was the thought of these disappointments, these lost opportunities over which he had no control, which in his later years unsettled his brilliant mind. While the eclipse expeditions did not result in the cutting-edge visual record David had envisioned, they still served the function of getting his name and that of Amherst College into the newspapers and magazines of the day. Some of these articles were almost certainly written by Mabel, whose highly stylized prose and literary flair differed significantly from David's. The series of articles about David's work appearing in the popular press of the day did help him to fund the next expedition and shone light on Amherst College as well. Perhaps because of his proven ability to generate publicity for the college, David was tasked with the preparation of the Amherst College exhibit in the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. In Mabel's recounting of it, David's exhibit for Amherst is decidedly the best of the smaller colleges. His divans covered with corduroy, thus utilizing his packing boxes for which an exorbitant storage was charged, are decorative triumphs in their way, with their down pillows of purple and white satin. Also, his elegant bromide enlargements of buildings and interiors, his faculty and trustees in frames, his frieze of distinguished graduates, his great seal on purple and white satin, Dr. Storrs and Henry Ward Beecher, General Walker Roswell Hitchcock, Bishop Huntington, and Governor Bullock at the entrance, his bookcase of works by the faculty, and the pretty desk with Amherst alcove paper and envelopes headed by a seal. It is all in excellent taste and refined and attractive and makes a good showing of Amherst. So Mabel. Around the turn of the 20th century, some of David Todd's astronomical observations focused on Mars. This work was of interest to the wealthy mill owner and businessman turned astronomer Percival Lowell, who financed 2 of David's expeditions. Lowell believed that the canals on Mars provided evidence that this planet might host life. And this idea later inspired a whole genre of science fiction. Apparently, David came to believe this as well, for he began to design ways to send signals to Mars and to receive signals back from the intelligent life he was increasingly convinced lived there. David was an early believer in the utility of airplanes and hot air balloons as ways of providing a higher platform from which his astronomical experiments could occur. He founded the Aero Club at Amherst College, the first such organization in the nation. Though David was certainly not the only scientist attempting to signal Mars, Guglielmo Marconi, for instance, was also experimenting with radio transmissions to the red planet. David's convictions seem to be held more deeply. David stated in an interview with the Amherst student, quote, "If there is life on Mars, the people there ought in the nature of things to surpass us in intelligence. I intend to get up as high and stay up as long as possible to send signals up in the rarefied atmosphere with nothing to disturb us." And after years of not only publishing academic articles about aspects of astronomy, but also cultivating media contacts that would enable him to get his work into the popular press, David found that his attempts to signal the Martians drew much media scrutiny. But the coverage wasn't always entirely positive. For example, an article in the New York Times in 1924 explaining David's development of a machine designed to receive radio signals from Mars quoted a scientist involved in the analysis of data garnered from this so-called listening in, that while he couldn't explain the results, they were quite likely the results of interference of radio signals, a freak we can't explain, and not evidence of intelligent life, as David had suggested. Not surprisingly, David began to face derision from his colleagues. Noted former Amherst professor F. Curtis Canfield, class of 1925, in a somewhat facetious tribute to David, his exploits, successful or not, always got headlines in the national press. Amherst had no need of a publicity department with Davy Todd on the faculty. David's departure from scientific rigor was paired with his apparent departure from sanity. His behavior became increasingly erratic. His attendance at meetings, even his own classes, was quite sporadic as well. Mabel and Millicent reported his strange sleeping patterns. By 1917, Amherst College President Alexander Meiklejohn stated that the Board of Trustees had granted him a, quote, indefinite leave of absence. On the whole, I think it would be better for us and possibly for you if your leave of absence were continued, wrote Meiklejohn. The work in astronomy has not gone well and has been pretty thoroughly out of harmony with the general scheme of instruction. In the spring of 1917, David and Mabel left Amherst for Florida. There, his behavior devolved further. He spent money lavishly. He sent Millicent on wild errands to find people who did not exist in places that didn't either. His sexual infidelities, an issue throughout his life, became more pronounced and less discreet. He periodically disappeared from his home without warning, without letting anyone know where he was, causing Millicent and her new husband, psychologist Walter Van Dyke Bingham, to go off in desperate search of him. He launched a series of increasingly wild schemes, ranging from his plans to keep the sun from breaking apart, something he was convinced would occur within his own lifetime, to finding lost buried treasure. By 1922, Mabel and Millicent had come to the excruciating conclusion that David needed to be institutionalized. Between that point and his death in 1939, he was in and out of various mental hospitals, nursing facilities, and asylums. David Peck Todd's Amherst College career was filled with both significant achievements and significant setbacks. He came to see the destruction of his first office in Walker Hall, which burned to the ground in 1882, as the leitmotif of his life. Millicent later wrote that elemental forces stymied her father at every turn, whether fire, which destroyed his calculations, the foundation of his next discovery and building store of his astronomical reputation, or the cosmos, which rewarded years of preparations for observing a total eclipse of the sun each time by shutting it out. And yet, David Todd's work during the time he was at Amherst College influenced the development of astrophotography in ways he probably foresaw would become the standard in his field, but did not realize during his own lifetime. Mabel Loomis Todd was initially reluctant to come to Amherst. An excellent musician, a talented painter and writer, an extremely socially engaged person used to the vibrant arts community and society of Washington, D.C., Mabel was fearful that the small college town would not yield her as many opportunities as she was used to. But within a few short weeks, Mabel was writing in her journal, "Do you know, I think of Amherst in many respects quite ideal. I always did like a college town with its air of quiet cultivation, and by living in such a one, it is possible to continue two things which are otherwise generally not found together. I mean the possibility of living in the country amid the luxuriance of nature, and yet of having refined and educated society at the same time." Now, part of the reason for Mabel's rapid about-face was having made the acquaintance of Susan and Austin Dickinson. Her friendship with members of the Dickinson family, leading citizens of the town with deep ties to the college, Austin's grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, was one of Amherst's founders, and his father, Edward, had served many years as its treasurer, would eventually lead her into a 13-year-long extramarital relationship with Austin, an Amherst alumnus, class of 1850, and treasurer of the college after his father. It would also introduce her to the poetry of Emily, one of Austin's younger sisters. The Mabel-Austin relationship, which has been written about extensively in my book as well as elsewhere, was not only incensed the town of Amherst, but also set up a toxic dynamic between the Todd and Dickinson families that had many long-lasting effects, including, ultimately, the division of Emily Dickinson's papers between Amherst College and Harvard University. Throughout the 36 years she lived in Amherst, Mabel was deeply invested in both the college and the community. Faculty wives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were largely tasked with keeping house and social obligations that required a considerable amount of unpaid service, like sponsoring receptions, teas, and events of many types. Apart from the social duties she had as a faculty spouse, Mabel frequently performed as a pianist or singer at college events. She also taught both music and art at a school developed by Mary E. Stearns, wife of former Amherst College president William Augustus Stearns, that operated out of the president's home. And she chaperoned Amherst College dances. Mabel's daughter, Millicent, once related that back in 1892, her mother had discovered that, quote, when two Negro boys invited their guests to commencement, the Southern boys refused to go to the promenade if the Negro couples were permitted to attend. Having heard this, my mother invited them as our house guests, along with Catherine Garrison, granddaughter of William Lloyd Garrison, and held a reception for them at our home. Mabel's position as spouse of an Amherst College professor who chased eclipses enabled her to travel the world in a way few people of the late 19th century, and even fewer women, were able to. She documented her travels to Japan, Tripoli, and throughout Southeast Asia, Europe, and South America in many articles and 2 books. She also brought back to Amherst crates filled with artifacts she collected from indigenous cultures, which initially decorated her homes in Amherst and eventually were donated to museums throughout the Northeast. Now, parenthetically, Mabel thought of these artifacts as artwork. Millicent thought of them as the heathenish clutter of her childhood home. Mabel also actually shipped back to Amherst an entire rickshaw that she purchased in Japan. There are reports of her tooling around the Amherst countryside in this rickshaw, much to the great surprise of her neighbors. This photograph was taken in front of her home in Florida. Apparently, Mabel became so attached to this form of transportation that she moved it once again. Mabel's role as the spouse of an astronomer meant that she learned a great deal about the field and assisted David in many of his endeavors. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, she probably ghost wrote a number of pieces that went under his byline. She also became knowledgeable enough to give talks about different aspects of astronomy. She wrote a book entitled Total Eclipses of the Sun, and she even co-wrote a textbook on astronomy with noted 19th century science writer Joel Dorman Steele. When David was asked to prepare the exhibit to represent Amherst College at the 1893 Columbian Expedition, it was Mabel who helped him curate it and presented the college's achievements to the world in writing. Mabel's many civic contributions to the town of Amherst included her founding of the Amherst Women's Club in 1893, the development of the Mary Mattoon chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1894, and, of course, notably, the establishment of the Amherst Historical Society in 1896. Perhaps less heralded, but equally noteworthy, were Mabel's contributions to saving areas of forest in Amherst. In 1913, her efforts led her to be elected as chairperson of the Amherst Forestry Association. Mabel began to purchase land for preservation and wrote widely about it. Her purchase of an island off the Maine coast eventually led to the development of the Hog Island Audubon Camp for adult learners, with the unique, at the time, mission of teaching teachers about environmental education. Mabel would also later become involved with efforts that led to the creation of the Everglades National Park. Millicent wrote of her mother retrospectively, Mrs. Todd's love of fine trees sometimes led her into efforts which used up a great deal of time. I sometimes feel that the memorial she would value most would be a forest. Indeed, Millicent would honor her mother by donating the 80 acres of land that Mabel had purchased to save the trees to Amherst College in 1961. Though Mabel herself aspired to be remembered most for her writing, during her lifetime she published over 200 articles on an astonishing array of topics in all the leading magazines and newspapers of the day, and wrote or edited a dozen books. She is remembered principally for her work editing and publicizing the writings of someone else. The irony of being remembered most as Emily Dickinson's first editor would be one that is not lost on Mabel. I think that most of you are probably familiar with much of the next part of Mabel's story. After Emily Dickinson died in 1886 and her sister Lavinia discovered a cache of poems that no one knew existed, she became determined to share them with the world. This task eventually came to Mabel, who recognized the strange power of Emily's poetry the first time that Sue Dickinson had shared a poem with her in 1881. After agreeing to this considerable undertaking, Mabel spent the next decade deciphering, editing, publishing, and publicizing the poetry and letters of the reclusive Amherst poet. Aided by abolitionist and leading 19th century literary critic Thomas Wentworth Higginson with the first 2 volumes of poetry, Mabel's work served to catapult Emily Dickinson to the forefront of America's literary figures. The first several volumes of poetry sold out quickly and garnered excellent reviews. Mabel also used her prowess as a public speaker, launching a series of talks about the life and craft of the so-called Amherst myth to promote Dickinson's work, as well as to increase sales. Though her editing of the poetry has been heavily debated, there is no doubt that without her efforts, the world would not know the Emily Dickinson we know today. Now, Mabel received a total of only $200 for all of her work editing and publishing Emily's letters and poetry. Lavinia Dickinson claimed copyright of all of Emily's works and refused to share more than a tiny fraction of the profits she realized from their sale. In an effort to, quote, make things more right, Austin Dickinson wanted to deed Mabel a piece of land that he owned, but he died before he actually enacted any paperwork. Though Mabel did follow up and got Lavinia to deed her the land, the one remaining Dickinson sibling reneged and brought a lawsuit against Mabel and David in 1897. When Mabel lost both the lawsuit and an appeal, she decided that she'd had quite enough dealings with the Dickinsons. She took the remaining unpublished poetry and all of the other Dickinson papers in her possession, put them in a camphorwood chest, and locked it away for 3 decades. It was only after Austin and Susan's last surviving child, Martha, or Maddie as she was known, began to publish her aunt's poetry again in 1914, that Mabel began to think that there would come a point at which she would want to jump back into the Dickinson fray. This didn't happen until the early 1930s, when Mabel decided to try to correct some of the errors that she felt Martha Dickinson Bianchi had made in her editions of Emily's poetry and the retelling of her aunt's life. In a series of articles in a reissue of the Letters of Emily Dickinson in 1931, Mabel demonstrated to the world that she was still an authority in this area and a force to contend with. Of course, the controversies about Mabel's work on Dickinson letters and poems didn't end there. They continue even today, appearing in print, on the stage, on the big silver screen, and on the smaller ones on which we consume our televisual materials. People either love Mabel Loomis Todd or they hate her. There seems to be absolutely no one who is neutral. Writing after her mother's death in 1932, Millicent recounted that a friend of Mabel's had said, "Every outside thing she did came right back to Amherst to be shared here. Many contributions, her civic leadership, her land stewardship, her artistic writing and editing endeavors were all rooted in Amherst and shared with the world." As the only child of Mabel and David Todd, Millicent spent her entire life believing that it was her obligation to finish her parents' unfinished business. This enormous sense of filial responsibility, paired with her repressed but certain knowledge of her parents' lack of fidelity to one another, her growing understanding of her mother's dependencies and of her father's mental illness, as well as the extent to which her parents outsourced her own upbringing to her grandparents the majority of her first decade of life, meant that Millicent grew into adulthood with highly conflicted feelings. Her profound ambivalence about her parents only grew when she saw herself as someone with a completely different moral compass than her mother, and when she was forced to confront the increasingly distressing manifestations of her father's mental illness. Though she loved her parents dutifully, she desired nothing more or less than to distance herself from them. This proved to be impossible, and it is clear that much of the trajectory of Millicent Todd Bingham's life emanated from and returned to Amherst, and that her most significant professional contributions did as well. In 1923, Millicent became the first woman to receive a PhD in geology and geography from Harvard University. She seemed on target for a successful academic career, teaching at both Columbia University and Sarah Lawrence College, publishing in the field of regional geography until 1929. It was then, with the centenary of Emily Dickinson's birth looming, that Mabel reached out to her daughter and asked for help in preparing a new edition of the Letters of Emily Dickinson. Millicent knew that were she to do this, it would tear her away from her own career. But despite her many deep-seated reservations, she agreed. Millicent retooled herself professionally, not only assisting Mabel in a reissue of the Letters of Emily Dickinson in 1931, but also taking over Mabel's Dickinson work after her death. Millicent edited the remaining unpublished poems that had been stashed away in the camphorwood chest and brought out a new volume of Emily's poetry in 1945. Millicent also wrote 3 books about Emily Dickinson's life and craft. Now, I also think that Millicent needs to be credited for saving the scraps, as she called them, the odd little envelopes, shopping lists, and other pieces of paper on which Emily had written drafts of her poems or partial poems. I do think that this went beyond the Todd penchant for never throwing out a single piece of paper. Indeed, there are 721 boxes of Mabel, Millicent, and David's materials in the archives at Yale University. But no, Millicent instinctively knew that Emily's scraps would one day tell an important piece of the story of how this poet crafted her poetry. And speaking of the plethora of papers the Todd family generated, one of the ongoing sources of anxiety for Millicent throughout most of her adult life was the accumulation of family materials she had been bequeathed, as well as the trunk full of Dickinson poems, letters, and other family papers. Millicent felt singularly responsible for dealing with the thousands of pages of the so-called accretions of the ages, as she referred to them. Millicent was keenly aware that the Dickinson materials in her possession were of particular value. Though Harvard University had acquired a large collection of Dickinson materials and was anxious to obtain Millicent's as well, she believed that Emily's poems and letters belonged back in the town in which she had lived and in which she had written them. And so in 1946, Millicent reached out to Charles Cole, the newly inaugurated president of Amherst College. She attempted to orchestrate a deal in which Amherst would not only take all of her Dickinson materials, but also the 80 acres of land in nearby Pelham and all of her family papers and artifacts as well. After 10 years of discussions, including a series of exceedingly difficult negotiations with Harvard, still in pursuit of the Dickinson papers, the Amherst College Board of Trustees agreed to accept Millicent's gifts. The Dickinson papers were cataloged at the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., administered by Amherst College, and then shipped to Amherst. Millicent's collection of family papers and artifacts began to be sent to the college and were swiftly placed in storage. Her land bequest was finalized in 1961. Of course, Amherst's newly opened Frost Library was not set up to receive vast quantities of archival materials, and their main interest was in the Dickinson papers, not in the huge accumulation of the Todd Bingham family papers. In 1960, President Cole wrote to Millicent that the Board of Trustees was willing to, quote, release her from her agreement should she wish to place her family collections elsewhere. Fortunately for all of us, Yale University, which was set up to receive and archive big collections, was willing to accept the vast Bingham Todd compendia. Amherst College retained the Dickinson poems, letters, and documents relating to Mabel and Millicent's editing of them, making the college one of 2 major repositories of Emily Dickinson's papers and the one with the largest and most varied holdings. In the winter of 1957, Millicent received a letter from the Board of Trustees informing her that she would receive an honorary doctorate of letters from Amherst College that spring. She wrote to Charles Cole, "This is not only a very great surprise, it is an equally great honor, which I accept with gratitude and with humility. Please express to them my deep appreciation of an honor which stamps with their approval my long crusade to free the work of Emily from the exclusive claims which in the past have hampered scholars in their study of her poetry." Millicent's most ardent goals had been to ensure that Emily Dickinson's story would be told in the manner that she and Mabel thought it needed to be, to publish the remainder of the poems, and most of all, to ensure that future scholars would have access to the materials. Millicent always believed that Emily's papers belonged in Amherst, and that from Amherst they could be shared with the world. Millicent would have been most gratified to know that this goal has been realized. In 2012, Amherst College launched an open access website that contains all of the Dickinson materials they owned. Millicent is also responsible for working to finish her mother's projects in other ways. She not only donated the Dickinson papers to Amherst College, she also donated the land, which subsequently became known as the Mabel Loomis Todd Forest, and was used by Amherst College in the early 1960s as a kind of experiential education in its nascent ecology program. Millicent also worked tirelessly to donate all of Hog Island to the National Audubon Society, a gift that was finalized in 1960 with a ceremony that included her good friend, Rachel Carson. The Hog Island Audubon Camp is still going strong today, a fantastic environmental experience for teachers, adults, and families. The Todds all so identified with Amherst and with Amherst College that it was part of the moniker by which they identified themselves. David always referred to himself as an Amherst College professor, even when he wasn't any longer. Mabel always chose to be listed as the wife of an Amherst College professor, even though this was hardly her most salient personal or professional characteristic. And Millicent, who had such a conflicted relationship with both of her parents and whose childhood in Amherst was filled with such difficult associations that plagued her for the rest of her life, still felt the connection to Amherst College so keenly that she made one of her life's big missions to ensure that the Emily Dickinson papers in her possession would ultimately go to the college. Part of the story of how tied David, Mabel, and Millicent all were to Amherst can be found in their final resting places. Though neither Mabel nor David Todd died in Amherst, Millicent made sure that they were both buried in a plot in Wildwood Cemetery, a cemetery that incidentally Austin Dickinson had helped to create. He is buried with his family down the hill from the Todds. Millicent, who spent the majority of her long life living outside of Amherst, is buried beside her husband in Arlington National Cemetery. Even though she made the decision to have her final resting place far from her parents, Amherst was still very much on Millicent's mind in her last years. She actually contacted the company in Vermont that made Mabel and David tombstones to inquire if it might be possible to make a small slate to lay near her parents, informing anyone who came to pay their respects that, in fact, she was buried almost 400 miles to the south. That slate was never made. But for Millicent, as for Mabel and David, Amherst would always be a significant part of who she believed herself to be. Amherst was inextricable from the Todds' identity, and their professional contributions, from eclipses to ecology to Emily Dickinson, all of which had their roots in Amherst, reverberated out from the Pelham Hills to the world. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
I suppose one question, where did Millicent end up living if she wasn't living in Amherst?
Millicent spent most of her adult life living in New York City and then in Washington, D.C. She also lived for a number of years overseas. She lived in Germany and she lived in France.
Is that Elsa with the hand up? No.
Thank you. It's Elisa. Thank you.
Elisa, yeah.
I just want to say I knew quite a bit about Mabel and her husband, David, but I knew very little about Millicent. This is fascinating. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I will just add that if you're interested in Millicent, there's a lot more about her that you can learn that's in my book. I could have written a whole book about Millicent. She's a very important part of this story.
I see we have something in the chat. Joanne Gates, did Millicent have memories of Amherst while Edward Dickinson was alive?
No, she didn't come to Amherst until after Edward had died.
I see Madeline McGee had a question. Do the Todds have living descendants?
No. Mabel was an only child. Millicent was an only child, and Millicent did not have any children. And actually, it's a good question, Madeline, because I think that was actually part of what accounted for some of Millicent's angst. She was just acutely aware of the fact that she was last in the line of her family, and that added to the very considerable burden she felt to try to finish up all of her parents' unfinished business.
Joanne Gates says, you hint, but are careful not to say, that David may have had syphilis. Are there any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that is a theory that number of people have advanced. I have actually looked through a lot of his papers at Yale, and what I can tell you is that while Millicent saved an awful lot of records, she didn't save a lot of records about her father's health. And there may be reasons that she didn't do that, that she saved things a little bit more selectively. So certainly some of the manifestations of syphilis can be some of the things that were observed about David. He absolutely was somebody who had many, many, many sexual partners, so it wouldn't be surprising if he suffered from syphilis, but we don't have proof positive of that.
Elisa again.
I don't know what the state of medical knowledge would have been then to actually diagnose something. Do you? I mean, it seems to me,
yeah,
it was pretty primitive.
Don't know. Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind is that in his last years, David, as I had mentioned, he was sort of in and out of different sorts of institutions. Some of them were medical facilities, some of them weren't. And in the end, he actually died in a private home with a round-the-clock nurse. So and to my knowledge, they didn't do an autopsy. So I don't think we have a lot of good information. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thank you, Elisa.
Joanne Gates says, tell us about Mabel's stroke in the Amherst College swimming pool.
Yes, well, yeah, she did blame Susan Dickinson. In 1913, on a hot summer day, Mabel was about to go swimming, and she later described it, she felt like someone pushed her. And she had a pretty massive cerebral hemorrhage. And she actually was paralyzed for a time on her right side. She could not use either her right arm or her right leg. And for somebody who was as active as Mabel, this was really very challenging. She did, as I told George actually before we started, Mabel did learn how to write with her left hand. So that was there was nothing that was going to stop her from recording in her diary and her journal. And so she did learn to write with her left hand, and she did regain some use of her right hand and her right leg. Only a few months after the stroke, she actually was well enough to go on the eclipse expedition to Russia. So, I think of this really very much as part of Mabel's incredible life force. And there really were few things that she set her mind to do that she couldn't do. That is absolutely true, that she believed firmly that it was Sue Dickinson who had pushed her and caused the stroke.
It sounds like the definition of a spirited lady, to come back from a stroke that way. And you have several compliments here in chat. The lecture was a wonderful addition to your fabulous book.
Oh, thank you.
I was curious about when your screen of sort of things about Mabel, A Woman of the World.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a book, a play?
It's a play by Rebecca Gilman. It's a wonderful play. It's a one-woman play, much like The Belle of Amherst, but it shows other sides of Mabel's indomitable character. And it's one of the interesting things about it is that Millicent is a character in it, but she's sort of off stage. And the Mabel character is always turning around and saying, "Oh, Millicent, why are you saying that?" So it's another take on Mabel, and I always think that Mabel is so wonderfully dramatic that it's not surprising to me that she also was made into a successful play. So, anybody ever has the chance to see a production of that, I would certainly recommend it. I see another question in the chat about Millicent's relationship with Rachel Carson. So it's a very interesting friendship that the two of them developed. They were both up in Maine, not too far away from each other. They were both women of science who had pursued this. They both had mothers who were very dominant in their lives in some healthy and some really unhealthy ways. Rachel Carson's mother also had a stroke and refused to accept that she had had a stroke. So Millicent, there were all these different things that were really similar between Rachel Carson and her mother, and Millicent Todd Bingham and her mother. And so the two of them got to know each other. Millicent was a big supporter of Rachel Carson's work. Rachel invited Millicent to be her special guest at an event in New York City that was honoring her. They spent time together in Maine. And as you saw on my slide, Millicent invited Rachel to come and be part of the opening ceremony at Hog Island.
Are there other questions or comments? I don't see any hands up. Nothing is appearing in the chat. So we can thank you. Oh, no, Elisa, that was just a thumbs up, or? Okay. Thank you very much for your time. Anyone who hasn't read the book After Emily, I think is now inspired to do so, to learn more about this family. Oh, Kate Farrell, I see you have a heart for us. Thank you again, Dr. Dobrow.
Thank you so much, everybody.